The hammer rang against red-hot steel as Samuel Hayes shaped another horseshoe at his forge. At 67, his weathered hands moved with the steady rhythm of a man who had spent decades perfecting his craft. Gray beard streaked with silver framed a face carved by sun and wind, while pale blue eyes reflected the dancing flames before him. The simple leather apron he wore bore countless scorch marks and stains from 15 years of honest blacksmith work in Copper Falls. The thunder of approaching horses shattered the peaceful morning. 8 riders swept down the main street like a plague of locusts, their leader a massive man with cruel eyes and a scarred face that spoke of violence as a way of life. Cutter Murdoch dismounted outside the forge, his spurs jingling with each deliberate step. Behind him, his gang spread out with the practiced ease of predators who had done this countless times before. Murdoch's voice boomed across the workspace. "You owe protection money, old man. Every business in this territory pays tribute to keep operating." Samuel continued his rhythmic hammering, the steel beneath his tool glowing orange in the morning light. The sound of metal on metal never faltered, never acknowledged the interruption. The gang leader's face darkened at being ignored. "I said you owe me money, blacksmith." Samuel finally looked up from his work, those pale eyes meeting Murdoch's glare with quiet calm. "I heard you the first time," he replied, his voice carrying the weight of years without the tremor of fear. "I decline your offer." Laughter erupted from the gang members. "The old hammer swinger thinks he can refuse us," one of them called out. Another spat tobacco juice near Samuel's feet. "Look at those shaky hands. Probably can't even swing that little hammer much longer." Murdoch stepped closer to the forge, his hand resting on the grip of his Colt. Nobody refuses Cutter Murdoch, especially not some decrepit fool playing with toys. Samuel set down his hammer with deliberate care, straightening to his full height. Those pale blue eyes never left Murdoch's face as he spoke. "I've built this forge with these hands. I serve this community. I owe you nothing." The explosion of violence came without warning. Murdoch's men overturned the heavy anvil with a crash that echoed through the street. Tools scattered across the dirt floor as they kicked over carefully organized workbenches. Hot coals spilled from the forge as they began their systematic destruction of 15 years of careful craftsmanship. Then came the flames. One of the gang members produced a bottle of whiskey and poured it across Samuel's leather bellows and wooden handles. The match that followed sent orange tongues licking hungrily at everything Samuel had built. The forge that had been the heartbeat of Copper Falls for a decade and a half began to burn. Samuel stood motionless as decades of work turned to ash before his eyes. The flames reflected in those pale blue orbs, but his expression remained unchanged. Townspeople scattered from doorways and windows, disappearing like smoke before the gang's presence. Only the old blacksmith remained, watching his life's work crackle and burn. Murdoch mounted his horse with satisfaction gleaming in his cruel eyes. "You have 3 days to come up with payment," he announced to the assembled town. "After that, there won't be a blacksmith or a forge left to worry about." The gang rode out with whoops and gunshots, leaving destruction in their wake. As the smoke cleared and silence returned to Copper Falls, Samuel Hayes stood alone among the ruins. His hands, steady as bedrock despite his years, remained at his sides. Those pale blue eyes continued to reflect the dying flames, but something else flickered there now. Something the gang had been too arrogant to notice. Something that would change everything in 3 days' time. 3 days stretched before Copper Falls like a death sentence. Cutter Murdoch's gang made their presence felt throughout the territory, riding through the main street twice daily with guns drawn and cruelty in their hearts. They overturned vegetable carts, smashed store windows, and helped themselves to whatever caught their fancy. The townspeople learned to scatter like leaves before a storm whenever hoofbeats thundered down the dusty road. Samuel Hayes made his camp among the charred remains of his forge, where once the great stone hearth had blazed with honest fire. Now only blackened timber and twisted metal marked 15 years of dedication. He spread his bedroll beneath the open sky, sleeping under stars like an old drifter with nowhere else to go. Each morning he rose before dawn, sorting through the wreckage with the patience of a man who had learned to rebuild from nothing. Young Sheriff Tom Bradley found him there on the second morning, picking through bent horseshoes and salvageable iron. The lawman removed his hat with nervous respect, revealing sandy hair and worried eyes that belonged to someone barely past 25. "Samuel, you need to leave town or pay the money," Bradley said, his voice carrying the weight of responsibility too heavy for his years. "I can't protect you against 8 armed men." Samuel looked up from his work, those pale blue eyes measuring the young sheriff with quiet assessment. "I appreciate your concern, Tom," he replied, continuing to sort through the debris. "But this is my home. These are my people. I won't be driven off by bullies." Bradley shifted uncomfortably, recognizing the steel beneath the old man's gentle words. The gang had guns, numbers, and a reputation for violence that stretched across 3 territories. What did one elderly blacksmith have against such odds? By afternoon, Samuel had cleared enough space to set up a temporary workspace. Using salvaged tools and a makeshift forge built from loose stones, he began accepting small jobs from townspeople too frightened to venture to the next settlement. A broken wagon wheel here, a bent plow blade there. Simple work that kept his hands busy and his mind focused. The steady ring of his hammer on metal provided a reassuring rhythm in a town that had forgotten what peace sounded like. But before you find out what happens next, if you're enjoying this story of hidden strength and unexpected courage, I'd love to know where you're listening from. Comment what country you're tuning in from, because these tales of justice and redemption travel across the world, and I love seeing how far they reach. Stay with me until the end, because what's coming will surprise you in ways you never expected. Martha Chun had run the general store in Copper Falls longer than most people had lived there. At 72, her memory remained sharp as the Damascus steel she occasionally ordered for special customers. She remembered the day Samuel Hayes had arrived 15 years ago, leading a pack mule loaded with tools and personal belongings. What caught her attention then wasn't the man himself, but the military saddle on his horse and the distinctive markings on his metalworking equipment. Those weren't civilian tools. They bore the unmistakable stamps of Army issue. Now, watching Samuel work his makeshift forge with practiced efficiency, those old memories stirred like dust in an abandoned room. His hammer strikes followed a rhythm that seemed familiar, almost like a marching cadence she had heard during her youth when cavalry troops passed through town. There was precision in his movements, economy of motion that spoke of training far beyond what any frontier blacksmith required. Each blow landed exactly where intended, no wasted effort, no hesitation. Murdoch's gang grew bolder as the deadline approached. They cornered Martha outside her store, demanding tribute money while pawing through her merchandise with dirty hands. When she refused, they upended shelves and scattered goods across the floor. Young Sally Morrison, barely 16, found herself trapped in the alley behind the bakery while 3 gang members made crude suggestions and blocked her escape. Old Pete Williamson watched helplessly as they stole his month's wages and laughed at his protests. Samuel appeared wherever the damage was worst. Without fanfare or grand gestures, he helped Martha repair her shelving with joints so precise they seemed crafted by a master carpenter rather than a blacksmith. He reinforced Sally's father's door with metalwork that would stop a charging bull, and quietly replaced Pete's stolen tools with ones forged fresh from his temporary setup. His work possessed a quality that made other craftsmen stare in wonder. These weren't the rough repairs of a frontier tradesman, but the precise creations of someone who understood metal the way poets understand words. Martha found herself studying Samuel's hands as he adjusted a hinge on her store's front door. The scars were wrong for blacksmith work. Burns and forge marks, yes, but also thin white lines that could only come from blade cuts. Defensive wounds on his forearms. Nick marks on his knuckles from deflecting sword strikes. These were the hands of someone who had fought with steel against steel, not just shaped it over flame. The gang members noticed Samuel's activities, but saw only what they expected to see. An old fool playing with his toy hammer, they called him. Look at those useless old hands. Probably can't even grip that piece of metal properly. They rode past his temporary forge with sneers and crude jokes, completely missing the way townspeople began gathering around Samuel's workspace. They didn't see how his quiet competence drew people like a lodestone draws iron filings. On the evening of the second day, Samuel stood in the ruins of his original forge as twilight painted the sky purple and gold. Sheriff Bradley approached again, this time with genuine worry creasing his young features. "They mean to kill you tomorrow," he said without preamble. "Murdoch doesn't make idle threats. Maybe you should consider leaving just until they move on to easier territory." Samuel continued staring at the wreckage of his life's work, those pale blue eyes reflecting the last light of day. "Tomorrow's the third day," he said finally, his voice carrying a certainty that made Bradley's skin crawl. "After that, things change." The sheriff wanted to ask what he meant, but something in Samuel's tone warned against further questions. Instead, he touched his hat and walked away, leaving the old blacksmith alone with his memories and whatever plans were forming behind those winter-cold eyes. As darkness fell over Copper Falls, Samuel Hayes began making preparations. The townspeople slept fitfully, knowing violence would come with the sunrise. But they had no idea that their quiet blacksmith was preparing for something far different than surrender or flight. 15 years of peaceful forge work was about to end, and the man who had sought refuge from his violent past was preparing to remember skills he had spent a decade and a half trying to forget. Dawn broke over Copper Falls like spilled blood across the eastern horizon. The third day had arrived with all the inevitability of winter's first frost. Cutter Murdoch rode into town with 8 armed men flanking him, their horses kicking up clouds of dust that settled over the frightened community like a burial shroud. Windows slammed shut and doors barred themselves as decent folk disappeared from the streets. Only one man remained visible in the growing light. Samuel Hayes stood alone among the charred ruins of his forge, but something had changed overnight. Gone was the simple leather apron and work clothes of a frontier blacksmith. Instead, he wore dark trousers and a white shirt that seemed to belong to a different era, a more formal time. In his weathered hands, he held something that made Sheriff Bradley's breath catch in his throat as he watched from behind the jailhouse window. The weapon was a saber, its blade catching the morning sun like captured lightning. Not some crude frontier knife or utilitarian tool, but a genuine military sword with elegant curves and perfect balance. The steel gleamed with the care of someone who understood its true purpose, and the brass guard bore intricate engravings that spoke of official military issue. This was no blacksmith's implement. This was an instrument of war. Sheriff Bradley found himself moving without conscious thought, drawn by recognition that struck him like a physical blow. He had seen weapons like this before during his brief stint at Fort Riley, where his father had served as a supply sergeant. Only cavalry officers carried sabers of this particular design, and only those with distinguished service records earned the right to keep them after retirement. Murdoch dismounted with theatrical swagger, his gang spreading out in a practiced formation designed to intimidate and control. The morning air carried the scent of leather, gun oil, and unwashed bodies as 8 killers prepared to collect their tribute from one elderly man. Their leader's voice boomed across the ruins with cruel satisfaction. "Time's up, old fool. You can pay me what you owe, or I'll put you in the ground next to your precious forge." Samuel's response was silence, but his posture began to shift in ways that made Bradley's military training scream warnings. Shoulders squared with parade ground precision. Feet positioned in the classical stance taught to cavalry officers for mounted and dismounted combat. The saber rose slightly, not in threat but in readiness, held with the expert grip of someone who had learned its use from masters of the art. Those pale blue eyes had gone flat and cold as winter ice, devoid of the warmth that had characterized the peaceful blacksmith. Bradley crept closer, his lawman's instincts overriding common sense. The saber's brass guard came into focus, revealing details that made his blood run cold. Engraved letters spelled out words that transformed everything he thought he knew about Samuel Hayes. Model 1860 Light Cavalry Saber. Officer's Pattern. The inscription below read like a military citation that belonged in history books rather than a frontier blacksmith's hands. Captain Samuel Hayes, 7th Cavalry Regiment, Fort Riley, Kansas. Distinguished Service, Wounded Knee Campaign, 1890. The words hit Bradley like rifle shots as understanding crashed over him in waves. This wasn't just any retired soldier standing in the ruins of a forge. This was Captain Steelhands Hayes, the legendary cavalry instructor whose reputation had spread throughout the entire western frontier. Memory flooded back like water through a broken dam. Stories told around army campfires about the master swordsman who had trained 3 generations of cavalry officers. the man who had developed new techniques for mounted saber combat and written the manual that every cavalry school still used. The officer who had earned his nickname by killing 7 Apache warriors in single combat using nothing but his saber and tactical brilliance that bordered on genius. Samuel had come to Copper Falls 15 years ago seeking peace after Wounded Knee, hanging up his sword to forge horseshoes instead of shaping warriors. The gentle blacksmith who mended plowshares and shod horses had once been the most feared cavalry officer between the Mississippi and the Pacific. His forge had been a refuge from the violence that had defined his military career, a place where he could create instead of destroy. But now the saber was in his hands again, and the transformation was complete. The stooped elderly craftsman had vanished, replaced by a cavalry officer whose reputation had become legend among fighting men. Every movement spoke of training so ingrained it had become instinct, muscle memory that 15 years of peaceful blacksmithing couldn't erase. This was Captain Hayes in full command of his deadly skills. Murdoch remained oblivious to the change, seeing only what he expected to see. An old man with an antique sword, probably too weak to lift it properly. His gang members chuckled and made crude jokes about museum pieces and the futility of bringing a knife to a gunfight. They had no idea they were facing a master of mounted warfare whose tactical genius had been studied at West Point. Samuel spoke for the first time since Murdoch's arrival, his voice carrying the authority of command that had once directed cavalry charges against impossible odds. "I gave you a chance to leave peacefully," he said, the words falling like stones into still water. "That chance has passed." The saber moved slightly in his grip, finding the perfect balance point that would allow maximum efficiency in the coming violence. Bradley watched in fascination and terror as history prepared to repeat itself in the ruins of a frontier forge. Captain Steelhands Hayes was about to remind the world why cavalry officers had once ruled the battlefield with nothing but steel, skill, and unbreakable will. Murdoch's laughter shattered the morning silence like breaking glass. "Look at this old fool with his museum piece," he roared to his gang, slapping his thigh in theatrical amusement. "Boys, I think Grandpa here wants to play swords with us. Maybe we should take that antique off his hands before he hurts himself with it." The first gang member to move never completed his draw. Samuel's movement was not fast in the way young gunfighters were fast. There was no flashy speed or dramatic flourish. Instead, his motion carried the surgical precision of 15 years active duty and 200 Apache warriors who had learned too late what cavalry training could accomplish. The saber swept in a perfect arc that severed leather holster, gun belt, and the man's confidence in a single stroke that followed textbook cavalry manual page 43. The weapon clattered to the dirt as its owner stared in shock at his ruined gear. Samuel had moved exactly 18 inches to his left, positioned his blade at the optimal angle for disarmament, and executed the maneuver with the economy of motion that separated professionals from amateurs. The man's gun hand remained untouched, but his ability to threaten anyone had vanished like smoke in the wind. 2 more gang members rushed forward, confident that numbers would overwhelm one elderly man regardless of his sword skills. They had never faced someone who had spent a decade training cavalry officers in the fine art of multiple opponent engagement. Samuel's blade work became a lesson in military efficiency, as he demonstrated why cavalry sabers had dominated battlefields for centuries before revolvers changed the nature of warfare. The second attacker found his pistol swept aside by a classical parry that redirected his weapon's muzzle toward the sky, while Samuel's riposte opened a precise cut across his gun hand that would heal but never forget. The third man managed to clear leather before discovering that cavalry officers had developed specific techniques for dealing with firearms at close range. Samuel's blade caught the barrel in a bind that twisted the weapon from numb fingers, while his pommel strike to the solar plexus dropped the man to his knees gasping for air that wouldn't come. Murdoch's expression shifted from amusement to confusion as 3 of his men found themselves disarmed and disabled in less time than it took to count to 10. This wasn't possible. Old men didn't move with such deadly precision. Frontier blacksmiths didn't possess combat skills that belonged to military academies and battlefield veterans. Yet the evidence lay writhing in the dirt before him. Samuel's voice cut through the morning air with the authority of command that had once directed cavalry charges against impossible odds. 15 years active duty, he stated matter-of-factly, while maintaining perfect guard position. 7th Cavalry Regiment. 200 Apache warriors. 53 battles. Wounded Knee, Pine Ridge, Rosebud Creek. Master instructor at Fort Riley for 8 years before retirement. The recitation continued as Samuel moved through the scattered gang members with tactical awareness that treated each opponent as a component in a larger puzzle. His training had included not just saber technique, but battlefield management, terrain usage, and the psychological aspects of combat that turned groups of individuals into manageable tactical problems. The ruins of his forge became an extension of his weapon as he used environmental advantages with the skill of someone who had fought on every type of terrain the frontier could offer. Hot coals from his makeshift fire became projectiles that scattered opponents and disrupted their formations. The heavy chains he used for lifting ironwork transformed into restraints that tangled legs and weapons with devastating effectiveness. Even his blacksmith hammers found new purpose as they sailed through the air with the accuracy of someone who had learned to make every thrown object count when ammunition ran low on hostile territory. One gang member tried to circle behind Samuel while his attention seemed focused elsewhere, not understanding that cavalry training included awareness of threats from all directions simultaneously. Samuel's peripheral vision had been honed by years of mounted combat, where death could come from any quarter without warning. The would-be attacker found himself facing the saber's edge before he realized he had been detected, his own weapon knocked aside by a backward cut that military manuals classified as an advanced technique requiring years of practice to master. Another tried to overwhelm Samuel with sheer aggression, rushing forward with both hands gripping his pistol like a club. This approach might have worked against an ordinary opponent. But Samuel had faced Apache warriors whose courage and skill far exceeded anything these frontier bullies possessed. The attack was channeled and redirected using techniques developed for dealing with mounted opponents whose momentum could crush an unwary defender. The man's own force became the instrument of his defeat as Samuel's saber work guided him into a collision with the forge's stone foundation that ended his participation in the fight. Murdoch realized with growing horror that his numerical advantage was evaporating like morning mist before the sun. 2 of his men had fled outright, deciding that whatever payment he offered wasn't worth facing a legendary cavalry officer in single combat. For others lay in the dirt, alive but thoroughly convinced that their weapons were useless against someone who had trained generations of military officers in the art of mounted warfare. Samuel stepped over the fallen gang members with parade ground precision, his boots clicking against stone and metal debris with the rhythm of someone who had marched across half the continent in service of his country. The saber in his hands remained perfectly balanced, its tip describing small circles that spoke of readiness rather than fatigue. 15 years of peaceful blacksmithing had not dulled reflexes honed by decades of professional violence. The gang leader drew his Colt with desperate speed, but discovered that cavalry officers had developed specific techniques for dealing with firearms during the transition period when both sabers and pistols dominated the battlefield. Samuel's blade moved in a defensive pattern that military manuals called a pistol parry, designed specifically to deflect bullets while maintaining offensive capability. The technique required split-second timing and absolute confidence in one's training, qualities that separated legends from ordinary soldiers. Murdoch's shot rang out across the ruins of the forge, but Samuel's saber had moved with the precision of someone who had practiced this exact maneuver thousands of times under the guidance of the finest military instructors in the country. The bullet struck steel instead of flesh, deflected harmlessly into the morning sky by a technique that few men alive had ever witnessed and fewer still could execute successfully. The Colt fell from Murdoch's nerveless fingers as he stared at the impossible sight of his perfectly aimed shot defeated by nothing more than skill and steel. Samuel advanced with measured steps, his saber held in the classical guard position that had been refined by centuries of military tradition. The morning sun caught the blade's edge, throwing reflected light across his weathered face and pale blue eyes that had gone cold as winter graves. "You burn my forge," Samuel said, his voice carrying the weight of absolute authority. "You terrorized my town. You threatened innocents under my protection." The words fell like sentence from a military tribunal where the verdict had already been decided and only the execution remained. Murdoch found himself facing not just a sword, but the accumulated justice of 15 years spent in peaceful service to a community that had welcomed him without questions about his violent past. The gang leader who had ruled 3 territories through fear and brutality now stood alone against a man whose reputation had been earned through discipline, training, and the kind of courage that facing death in service to others could forge in exceptional individuals. Captain Steelhands Hayes had returned from 15 years of retirement, and Cutter Murdoch was about to learn why cavalry officers had once been considered the elite of frontier military forces. Samuel advanced across the blood-stained dirt with the measured cadence of a parade ground inspection. Each step carried the weight of military discipline earned through 15 years of active service on the most dangerous frontier in American history. His saber caught the morning light as it moved in small, precise circles that spoke of readiness rather than aggression. Behind those pale blue eyes lay the accumulated experience of 53 battles and the kind of tactical brilliance that had made his name legend among fighting men from California to the Carolinas. Murdoch scrambled backward through the debris, his hands clawing desperately for any weapon within reach. The confident gang leader who had terrorized 3 territories through fear and brutality now faced something his limited experience had never prepared him to understand. This wasn't just another frontier gunfighter or angry townsman. This was a professional soldier whose reputation had been earned through discipline, courage, and the kind of training that transformed ordinary men into instruments of military justice. "You burned my forge," Samuel repeated, his voice carrying the authority of someone who had commanded cavalry troops in situations where hesitation meant death for everyone under his command. "You terrorized my town. You threatened innocents under my protection." The words fell like articles of accusation from a court-martial where the evidence had been weighed and the verdict decided by men who understood the difference between justice and revenge. "Please," Murdoch gasped, his back pressed against the stone foundation of what had once been Samuel's pride and joy. "I didn't know who you were. We can work something out. Money, land, whatever you want. I've got cash hidden in 3 different territories." The desperation in his voice would have moved a civilian to mercy, but Samuel had learned long ago that some forms of evil could not be negotiated with or reformed through compassion. Samuel's expression remained unchanged as memories flooded back like water through a broken dam. 15 years ago, he had ridden away from Fort Riley with his discharge papers and a heart heavy with the weight of what military service had required him to become. The man who had arrived in Copper Falls seeking peace had been Captain Steelhands Hayes, master instructor of cavalry tactics and veteran of more battles than most soldiers witnessed in 3 lifetimes of service. The nightmares had been the worst part. Dreams of Apache warriors falling beneath his blade, their courage and skill deserving better than death at the hands of an invading army. Visions of young cavalry officers he had trained, watching them ride into battles where his instruction was the only thing standing between them and unmarked graves in hostile territory. The weight of 53 battles had accumulated like scar tissue over his soul until the man who had once been the finest cavalry officer of his generation could no longer bear the cost of his own competence. Wounded Knee had been the final straw. Samuel had watched the massacre unfold with the helpless horror of someone who understood that military discipline and moral clarity could become tools of injustice in the wrong hands. The campaign that should have been his crowning achievement as a professional soldier had instead become the reason he could no longer serve an institution he had devoted his life to defending. The saber that had once been the symbol of his pride had become a reminder of everything he wished he could forget. So he had come to Copper Falls with nothing but his tools, his horse, and a desperate hope that 15 years of peaceful blacksmithing might wash the blood from his hands and the screams from his dreams. For a decade and a half, the forge had been his salvation. The rhythm of hammer on steel had replaced the thunder of cavalry charges. The satisfaction of creating horseshoes and farm implements had slowly healed wounds that no military surgeon could treat. He had found peace in service to a community that asked no questions about his past, and judged him only by his willingness to help when help was needed. But Murdoch had destroyed that peace with fire and threats and the casual cruelty that reminded Samuel why some men deserved no mercy from those strong enough to deliver justice. The gentle blacksmith who had shod horses and mended plowshares was gone, burned away in the flames that had consumed his forge. What remained was Captain Hayes, master of mounted warfare and executioner of military justice on a frontier where civilization ended at the edge of rifle range. Samuel raised his saber to the classical guard position that he had taught to hundreds of young cavalry officers over the years. The technique was called steel resolve in the manual he had helped write, designed for the moment when diplomacy failed and only force could restore order to chaos. Murdoch stared at the blade with the fascination of a rabbit watching an approaching snake, unable to look away from his own approaching doom. On the frontier, we protected civilians, Samuel explained with the patience of an instructor conducting a final lesson for a student who would never get another chance to learn. No exceptions. No mercy for those who prey on the innocent. No negotiations with evil that disguises itself as strength. The saber moved in a demonstration cut that stopped precisely 1 inch from Murdoch's throat, close enough for him to feel the displaced air against his skin. The gang leader tried to speak, but found his voice trapped somewhere between his paralyzed lungs and a throat gone dry with terror. Samuel continued his explanation as if addressing a class of young officers who needed to understand the moral framework that separated soldiers from murderers. You chose to make war on people who could not defend themselves. You burned the home of a man who sought only to serve his community in peace. You threatened to kill someone whose only crime was refusing to pay tribute to cowardice. Murdoch's eyes darted frantically around the ruins, searching for escape routes that military training had already identified and eliminated. Samuel had positioned himself to control all avenues of retreat while maintaining optimal striking distance for his primary weapon. The tactical situation was hopeless for anyone lacking formal military education, which described every frontier outlaw who had ever lived by gun and intimidation rather than discipline and training. Samuel began demonstrating the advanced saber techniques that had made his reputation at Fort Riley. Thrust and parry, he announced, executing a combination that would have opened Murdoch's chest if the blade had moved 6 inches forward instead of stopping in perfect control. Basic cavalry drill, taught to every first-year cadet. The steel sang through the air with surgical precision, each movement flowing into the next with the fluid grace of someone who had spent decades perfecting his craft. Riposte with wrist cut, Samuel continued, his blade tracing patterns that hypnotized his opponent with their deadly beauty. Academy standard for dealing with multiple opponents in close quarters. Disarming technique, he added as the saber swept in an arc that would have severed Murdoch's gun hand if Samuel had chosen to complete the movement. Field Manual page 47. Developed for mounted combat against firearms. Each demonstration was a lesson in the difference between crude frontier violence and professional military skill. Murdoch had lived his entire adult life believing that owning a gun and the willingness to use it were sufficient qualifications for taking whatever he wanted from whoever possessed it. Now he faced someone whose education in violence had been provided by the finest military institution in the country, refined through years of battlefield experience, and tempered by the kind of moral framework that separated warriors from killers. Your mistake, Samuel said as his blade found the precise position that military manuals called the executioner's mark, was believing that strength comes from the willingness to hurt the innocent. True strength protects those who cannot protect themselves. True courage faces evil even when the odds are impossible. You chose the path of a coward who preys on the weak. I chose the path of a soldier who serves something greater than his own desires. The saber moved with the speed of thought, but Samuel's target was not Murdoch's throat or heart, or any of the dozen vital points that cavalry training had taught him to find in the heat of battle. Instead, the blade traced a perfect line through the gang leader's gun hand, severing tendons and muscle with surgical precision that would heal but would never again grip a weapon with the confidence required for intimidating innocent people. Murdoch screamed as his Colt clattered useless to the ground, his dominant hand transformed into a useless appendage that would serve as a permanent reminder of the day he had chosen to threaten the wrong old man. Blood flowed between his fingers as he clutched the wound, staring at Samuel with the dawning realization that he had been granted a mercy he had never shown to any of his own victims. Samuel stepped back to parade rest, his saber returning to guard position with movements so ingrained they required no conscious thought. "You have 10 minutes to gather your men and leave my territory," he announced with the authority of someone who had delivered similar ultimatums to hostile forces across half the continent. "If I ever see any of you again, there will be no conversation, no warning, and no mercy. You will simply die." The gang leader struggled to his feet, cradling his ruined hand against his chest, while his surviving men helped him toward the horses. 2 of his original 8 were still unconscious from their encounter with Samuel's environmental warfare. 2 others had fled completely, deciding that whatever payment Murdoch offered was insufficient compensation for facing a legend in single combat. The remaining 4 moved with the careful deliberation of men who had discovered that their previous understanding of violence had been woefully inadequate. Within minutes, the thunder of hoofbeats announced the departure of Murdoch's gang from Copper Falls. They rode hard toward the territorial border, driven by the kind of fear that comes from realizing that some men are simply more dangerous than others, regardless of age or apparent frailty. Word would spread through the outlaw community that Captain Steelhand's Hayes had ended his retirement, and smart criminals would find other territories to terrorize. Samuel stood alone in the ruins of his forge, the saber heavy in his hands with memories of what it had once meant to carry such a weapon in service to his country. The townspeople began emerging from their hiding places, staring at him with expressions that mixed gratitude with something approaching awe. The gentle blacksmith they had known for 15 years was gone, replaced by something far more complex and dangerous. Sheriff Bradley approached with the cautious respect of someone who had witnessed military precision in action and understood that his entire conception of justice had just been redefined by a master of the art. "Captain Hayes," he said, using the rank for the first time since Samuel's arrival in Copper Falls. "The town owes you more than we can ever repay." Samuel looked down at the saber in his hands, seeing not just a weapon, but a symbol of everything he had tried to leave behind. The steel that had once been his pride and salvation had become his burden and his curse. He had sought peace in Copper Falls, but peace was not something a man like him could claim through wishful thinking. It was something that had to be earned through the strength to protect it when lesser men tried to steal it away. "Justice is not something you owe me, Tom," Samuel replied, using the formal tone that had once commanded respect from junior officers across the frontier. "Justice is something we owe to each other and to the community that shelters us all." Today that debt was paid in full. Dawn came to Copper Falls 3 days after Murdoch's defeat, bringing with it something the town had not seen in weeks: hope. The first wagon appeared on Main Street just after sunrise, loaded with salvaged stone and timber. Behind it came another, then another, until a steady stream of neighbors arrived carrying tools, supplies, and determined expressions that spoke of a community ready to reclaim what had been lost. Sheriff Bradley organized the work crews with military efficiency that he had learned by watching Samuel's tactical brilliance during the confrontation. Martha Chen coordinated supplies with the practical wisdom of someone who had survived 7 decades on the frontier. Even young Sally Morrison appeared with her father's carpentry tools, ready to contribute whatever skills she possessed to the effort of rebuilding what violence had destroyed. Samuel stood among the ruins of his forge, watching the townspeople transform destruction into opportunity. The blackened stones that had marked the end of 15 years of peaceful craftsmanship now became the foundation for something larger and more enduring. But as his neighbors worked with enthusiastic determination, Samuel noticed subtle changes in how they interacted with him that cut deeper than any saber could reach. Children who had once run freely through his workspace now watched him with wide eyes that mixed admiration with something approaching fear. The casual conversations that had flavored his daily routine were replaced by respectful nods and careful distance that acknowledged his transformed status in the community. Even Martha Chun, who had known him longer than anyone else in Copper Falls, brought him coffee with a deference that felt like a wall between them. Young men who had never shown interest in military service began asking questions about cavalry tactics, battlefield strategy, and what it felt like to kill a man in single combat. Samuel deflected these inquiries with the skill of someone who had spent 15 years avoiding such discussions, but their persistence reminded him that his violent past was now common knowledge throughout the territory. Word of Captain Steelhand's Hayes emerging from retirement would spread like wildfire through frontier communities hungry for stories about legends come to life. Within a week, the new forge took shape with contributions from craftsmen throughout the region. The stone foundation was twice as large as the original, built to accommodate not just Samuel's blacksmithing, but also the unofficial role he had assumed as protector of Copper Falls. The hearth was designed for maximum efficiency, with improvements that reflected both traditional craftsmanship and military engineering principles that Samuel had learned during his years at Fort Riley. But alongside the conventional blacksmithing tools, the townspeople insisted on modifications that acknowledged their protector's dual nature. A specially designed rack held his cavalry saber where it could be seen by anyone entering the forge. A locked cabinet secured additional weapons that Samuel had retrieved from storage, items that 15 years of peaceful retirement had not quite allowed him to discard entirely. The message was clear. Copper Falls would never again be defenseless against those who chose to prey on the innocent. Samuel resumed his traditional work with practiced efficiency, creating horseshoes, farm implements, and the countless metal necessities that kept frontier communities functional. But now his daily routine also included requests for items that served protection rather than production. Reinforced door hinges strong enough to withstand assault. Window bars that combined security with elegance. Hardware for gun cabinets that would keep weapons secure but accessible in times of crisis. Martha Chun noticed how Samuel approached these defensive commissions with the same meticulous attention he brought to peaceful projects, but his expression carried a weight that had not been present during his years of simple blacksmithing. Each piece of security hardware was a reminder that violence remained a possibility in their world, that the peace he had sought to create through honest labor was something that had to be actively defended by those strong enough to do so. Months passed as Copper Falls transformed itself into something unique among frontier communities. Word spread throughout the territory that the town was under the protection of Captain Steelhand's Hayes, and the effect was immediate and profound. Outlaw gangs that had once considered the settlement an easy target now avoided the region entirely, choosing softer prey that did not require facing a legendary cavalry officer in his own territory. But protection came with a price that Samuel had not fully anticipated. Young men began arriving from distant settlements, seeking training in military tactics and weapon skills from the master who had once instructed cavalry officers at Fort Riley. Samuel found himself reluctantly accepting students, teaching them not just saber technique, but the moral framework that separated warriors from killers. His forge became an unofficial military academy where the next generation learned that true strength served something greater than personal ambition. Sheriff Bradley proved to be his most dedicated pupil, trading his crude frontier fighting skills for genuine military training under Samuel's patient instruction. The young lawman learned cavalry tactics adapted for civilian law enforcement, discovering that proper training could multiply effectiveness while reducing the likelihood of unnecessary violence. Under Samuel's guidance, Bradley transformed from an overwhelmed frontier sheriff into a competent peace officer capable of maintaining order through competence rather than luck. The unofficial militia that developed around Samuel's training sessions became the foundation for regional security throughout the territory. Men who had once hidden behind locked doors when outlaws appeared now possessed the skills and confidence necessary to defend their communities. Samuel's reputation as an instructor proved as valuable as his legend as a warrior, creating a network of trained defenders that extended his protection far beyond the borders of Copper Falls itself. Years passed with the steady rhythm of seasons turning and communities growing. Samuel aged from a man in his late 60s to someone approaching 80, but his skills remained sharp and his reputation continued to grow. Young cavalry officers began making pilgrimages to Copper Falls, seeking instruction from the legendary master whose techniques had become standard curriculum at military academies across the country. His forge became a shrine to the kind of disciplined violence that protected civilization from those who would destroy it. The townspeople erected a memorial in the town square, not to commemorate death, but to celebrate the life Samuel had built among them. The bronze plaque spoke of 15 years of service as a blacksmith, but also acknowledged his military career and the day he had emerged from retirement to protect his adopted community. Children growing up in Copper Falls learned about Captain Steelhand's Hayes not as a figure from distant history, but as the man who shod their horses and taught their fathers how courage could triumph over fear. Samuel found peace in this recognition, not the perfect peace he had originally sought, but something more complex and ultimately more satisfying. His violent skills had been transformed from a burden into a gift he could share with others who needed to learn that strength without moral foundation was mere brutality. The forge that had been his refuge from war became the place where he prepared others to defend what he had helped them build. On quiet evenings when the work was done and the students had returned to their homes, Samuel would stand outside his rebuilt forge and watch the sun set over a community that had become more than he had ever dared hope. The saber that hung on his wall was no longer a reminder of what he wanted to forget, but a symbol of what he had chosen to remember. That some things were worth fighting for, and some people were strong enough to do the fighting when it became necessary. The legacy he left was not measured in the number of men he had killed or the battles he had won, but in the community he had protected and the students he had trained to carry forward the principles he had spent a lifetime learning to understand. Captain Steelhand's Hayes had found his final mission not in war, but in the preparation for peace, teaching others that the strongest sword was the one that never needed to be drawn because its mere presence was enough to deter those who would threaten the innocent. Martha Chun, now well into her 80s but still sharp as the steel Samuel worked with daily, would often sit outside his forge in the evenings and listen to the sound of his hammer shaping metal with the same rhythm that had marked his arrival in Copper Falls decades earlier. The sound was different now, she thought. Still strong, still precise, but somehow more complete. It was the sound of a man who had found his purpose not in spite of his violent past, but because of what that past had taught him about the true meaning of strength. When Samuel finally passed away at the age of 85, the funeral drew mourners from across 3 territories. Cavalry officers came to honor their instructor. Townspeople came to remember their protector. Students came to pay respect to the master who had taught them that skill without honor was worthless, and that the greatest victory was the battle that never had to be fought because the enemy knew he was already beaten. The forge continued to operate under the guidance of Samuel's most dedicated students. But the cavalry saber was never moved from its place of honor on the wall. It remained there as a reminder and a promise that Copper Falls would always be protected by those who understood the difference between strength and brutality, between justice and revenge, between the warrior who served others and the killer who served only himself. If you enjoyed this tale of hidden strength and the courage to stand when others won't, please like this video and subscribe to our channel for more stories of justice and redemption. We bring you tales of honor, sacrifice, and the kind of strength that protects rather than destroys every week. Until next time, may your forge burn bright and your blade stay sharp only for the defense of what matters most.